All right, welcome back. We are going to be talking about Chapter 14 in microeconomics. This is going to be labor markets and income. We'll touch on a whole lot of different things from labor market rules, monopsony, unions, um, uh, labor abuse, the laws that are on the books to prevent things like that, how monopsonies work, um, declining unionization over time. There's a lot in this chapter, so this should be fun. All right, so if you want to pause me and pull out the notes for Chapter 14 that I've provided under the file section of Canvas, you may do so, and then we will jump in. All right, Section 14.1, Theory of Labor Markets. Basically, the main rule of labor markets is that a firm will not pay more than their marginal productivity. A firm will not pay more in wages to a laborer than their marginal productivity to that firm's output. So it's basically, again, we're stuck on a supply-demand curve. We have a supply for laborers. We have a demand for labor. And we will meet at the equilibrium point under the assumption of a perfectly competitive system. Remember that. Always know what the assumptions are. Okay. So, if you look at 14.7, the market wage rate, where in a competitive labor market, where the supply of labor, S of L, crosses demand of labor, D of L, will be the equilibrium point, and it will not only determine the amount of labor in the market, which is the x-axis, but also the wage rate on the y-axis. All right. So the equilibrium will determine how many workers we will hire and at what wage in whatever labor market you want to talk about. Okay. All right. Section 14.2. Wages and employment in an imperfectly competitive labor market. Now, under many conditions in the labor market, labor is at a disadvantage. Labor, I would say, is almost always at a disadvantage, especially as an individual, because the firm has more power, the firm has more money, the laborer is desperate and needs income somewhere, right? And so the firm sort of has an inevitable advantage in the labor versus firm market, right? There are lots and lots of different ways over time that the government and governments around the world have protected laborers. And we'll touch on sort of why and when and what was the zeitgeist at the time. Zeitgeist just means the general feeling of the time. It's a German word for like time ghost. Basically, it's weird, right? But the general feeling of the contemporary period. So we'll talk about that. And there have been some really interesting movements towards and then back away from labor protection over time. So, some examples of ways that the government can improve labor's power. Minimum wages, of course. Minimum wage almost always tracks behind the medium wage. It's nearly inevitable. And so minimum wage legislation often doesn't actually do a whole lot. It helps a very, very small proportion of the society at the very bottom from being exploited. But generally, it's like 1 to 2% of the entire population is living on the minimum wage. They have working hour caps. So in the 30s, the United States government set it at 40. In a lot of Europe, it's set anywhere between 30 and 35 hours per week. And then past that, there's some distinction between the laborer and the firm as to whether I want to work overtime or not at a minimum of 1.5 times your regular salary, right? That's the American standard. And at that point, basically the government's saying, like, we don't want anyone being forced to work more than 40 hours. Now, if you want to work more than 40 hours and make more money, that's your prerogative, right? But the firm cannot force you to do so. Now, there are ways around this. When I worked for the university, basically what they do is they'll just say, we're going to pay you that very base rate as a manager. We're going to pay you that base salary of $52,000, and suddenly you're not... you don't qualify for overtime, and so you're exempt from overtime, and they can basically make you work until the job is done. So they're looking at this sort of legislation now about sort of closing these silly loopholes that are manipulated by firms and universities and whatever. To ensure that you don't actually get overtime and that you do work 55 or 60 hours a week like I was doing. It's like, all right, I'm fed up with this. Then you got child labor laws. These came about usually around the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. We'll talk a little bit about that. You've got safety laws, and this is generally the purview of OSHA, which is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. My dad owned a pest control company most of our life growing up, so there were always OSHA labels everywhere, all over the business, all over the house. The pesticides and chemicals and things of the sort are very highly federally regulated, and I almost wish they were more regulated because he died of cancer recently, and I think that was probably part of it. But yeah, the OSHA, Occupational Safety Hazard Administration, is sort of the umbrella organization that overlooks workplace safety, whether it be in a coal mine or a restaurant or wherever it might be. We have anti-discrimination laws on the books. These came about usually around the 1960s and 1970s. We'll talk about these. Family leave. This was the 1990s, but it has become a very, very popular... I wouldn't even say popular. It's become a very important piece of legislation that has sort of been like a revamp from the past that we're using during COVID to try and help offset some of the unemployment that would inevitably happen because of the long-term disease progression of some of this COVID stuff. So it's a very interesting thing that this law from the early 1990s is suddenly so important again under the auspices of the COVID economy. Let's see. Unemployment. This was again in the 1930s, and it's been strengthened and weakened and strengthened over time. Immigration limitations. This was the 1980s. Actually, this is really like every decade. There's some new boogeyman, whether it be Asians in the 1940s or blacks in the 1930s and 1960s, or whether it be Mexicans, which was the 1980s, and now under the sort of Trump administration. So there's always been sort of a immigration scapegoat. I think it's way overblown. And immigration, as we talked about in the former chapter, can be a really, really good thing. But there it is. Okay, so the basic laws, there's a big list in the book. I picked out most of them, but some of them I left by the wayside. I sort of just want to talk about what they are, where they came from, and what the context was for why they were established. All right. So in 1935, we see a huge explosion of protections for labor, protections for the environment, protections for unions, all of these sorts of things. And this is because of the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, the starvation and the bread lines, the massive suicides across the country, the runs on the banks, all of these sorts of things. So we start establishing a lot of social safety protections in the sort of Fair Labor Standards Acts, which set the minimum wage, put restrictions on child labor, and set standards for overtime and maximum numbers of hours that could be worked. The Social Security Act of 1935, which is one of arguably America's most important pieces of legislation, establishes a social safety net for not only the elderly and retirees, quote unquote, but also for unemployment. where you are forced to automatically pay in a certain amount of your income, and then you get unemployment protections, but you also get a retirement benefit, which is pretty minimal, but it's something, you know. Let's see. What else was I going to say? I was going to say something about this. I cannot remember. Move on. The National Labor Management Relations Act of 1935. This established a lot of the rules for unionization, the formation of unions, the back and forth between unions and the firms, this sort of thing. So again, the context is Black Tuesday, runs on the banks. You're starting to see Marxism spread across because of the just utter destruction in the system and the mass firing of people. You're also starting to get this a lot of exposés on labor abuse. So this is Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. Later in the 1940s and 50s, the sort of the environmental outcry of Silent Spring, which was about the use of what was that? There was a really famous, I can't remember off the top of my head, but there's a really famous pesticide that was being used in the 1940s and 1950s that they discovered was causing the shells of birds to become really soft, and it was causing things like retardation and mutation amongst birds. We were finding out that it was potentially going to make many bird species, including the American bald eagle, extinct. And so there was a big pushback because of this book called The Silent Spring. So there are a lot of books and exposés coming out at this time by reporters, journalists, and even sort of these gotcha journalists, saying, look at all of these things, like this is disgusting, these are the foods that you're eating, this is what is happening to children who are providing you with these products. They're missing fingers, they're missing ears, they're, half their jaws gone, their foot is missing, these sorts of things. So the government steps in and says, look, we've got to do something about this. People are writing to their senators and congresspeople, and so this is where a lot of this stuff comes from. In 1940s, you're starting to finally see a pushback against unions, because unions are, while they were very important in changing the direction of the United States during the Great Depression and sort of getting us up out of the Great Depression, they're also tied to Marxism and socialism and the ideas of the proletariat versus the owners of the means of production. I mean, even all of the language that is used in talking about labor relations is sort of the language that is attributable to Marx and Engels and the Communist Manifesto and these sorts of things. So we win World War II. Suddenly we find ourselves in not a war, but a Cold War, a philosophical war, a war of sort of hearts and minds, I guess, under the terminology of Bush II. Where suddenly unions are a little more scary, right? Unions are the proletariat pushing back against capitalism. And so you see this Taft-Hartley Act being passed under President Truman, which basically allows states to say that you can or cannot force people to join a union if they want a job at this particular firm. And so this has led to these sorts of right-to-work states like Texas, where I live, where your employer can basically just fire you for any reason at any time. And you can't unionize and these sorts of things. So it's interesting if you look at Amazon recently. Amazon is suffering a pushback in Alabama, no less, this really deep red anti-union state. Amazon factory workers are suddenly trying to determine whether they want to unionize or not, and other Amazon factory workers are also talking about this. So this extraordinary I think inequality that exists in our system that is even now today because of COVID spreading and becoming worse and worse. And Amazon is this just, multi-trillion-dollar company. You're starting to see a push for unionization come back because of, AOC and Bernie and I think some historical economists going back and saying, look how powerful and useful unions were and how much they've been demonized over time. And we're seeing these devastating economic consequences because of it, because labor has lost all of its power. We're not saying labor should have all power, but firms shouldn't have all the power either, right? And so there has to be some give and take, and we're losing the give on the union side. So this was the start of the death of unions, was the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947. All right, so we'll move on to the 1960s. We're still in the midst of the Cold War, but now we're also in the midst of the wild, roiling 1960s and the Civil Rights Movement. We are seeing massive marches. We're seeing cities burn. We're seeing the assassination of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And there's just America is in an uproar. It's really wild. It was a bit analogous to last summer where we saw all of this explosion after the death of George Floyd. It's sort of the same thing, but probably on steroids in the 1960s, where you're seeing entire cities sort of being lit on fire, and you're seeing riots, and the Democratic Convention even, you're seeing fires and riots being set. So it's a very turbulent time. And then you see the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and then Lyndon Baines Johnson from Texas, no less, comes in and says, we are going to protect black people. We are going to protect, we're going to end discrimination in America, was the whole point. It wasn't even just black people. It was, I am sick and tired of discrimination, and it's dragging this country down, and it's making us look morally inept. And so Lyndon Johnson steps in and signs the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which includes Title VII, which prohibits discrimination due to, quote, race, gender, national origin, religion, or sexual orientation. I say quote because it's interesting. Even today, this law is being argued about in the United States courts over trans rights. Can companies discriminate against transsexual people because trans is not included in the exact wording of Title VII? There is still some argument about whether this counts. Apparently, Amy Coney Barrett, in some of her more recent writings on the Supreme Court, has suggested that, look, I mean, even the far right is not going to suggest that we're trying to, discrimination is acceptable, regardless of who you were, and trans falls under the idea of gender or sexual orientation, and therefore it's silly for you to be bringing it to court on such a trivial word, right? Like an individual word. Sexuality and gender encompass the idea of trans, according to even the very far right side of the court, So again, it just sort of shows you how precise and specific you must be if you don't want to see future court cases, okay? All right, now we'll move on to the 1970s. The 1970s, you're seeing this environmental explosion. This is just after this book, Silent Spring, that I just talked about, is sort of blowing up on the market. People are learning about the Superfund in New York and the dumping of these radioactive materials and cancers in kids and families. They're finding out about the actual effects of things like carbon and the pollution in the air that's being plumed out through these smokestacks. They're starting to understand the effects of plastics, which, I mean, we are just destroying our world with plastics. And they aren't even really all that necessary. I mean, we had entire systems without plastic before this, where we recycled things and remade them. And I mean, I don't understand this whole thing, and it's a weird thing that we need to look at eventually, I think, too. But the 1970s see this explosion of even just the conceptualization and recognition of the environment, and that the environment is being destroyed, and that we need protections for the environment because eventually, you want your kids and your grandkids to have a decent, healthy world, right? And so they pass OHSA, the Occupational Health and Safety Act. This creates OSHA, which puts into place labor laws and things of this sort, protections against violence, protection against you have to pay out if one of your employees gets injured or killed on the job, these sorts of things. You have the Employee Retirement and Income Security Act of 1974. This is signed by Gerald Ford, and this basically says that companies cannot underfund their pensions purposefully, or they will pay a massive fine, and they will have to pay taxation, and all of that money will be funded back into the pension anyway, so don't do it. Because companies were stealing from their own pension funds, basically, and telling their employees, we're providing you with this pension, and it will take care of you in your old age, but then they weren't actually putting any money in it. The government said you can't do that. All right. Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978. This is under Jimmy Carter, and it prohibits discrimination against women planning to become pregnant, women who are pregnant, or women who want to return to work post-pregnancy. Okay. Then we move on to the 1980s. This is under the Reagan administration, and Reagan passes the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. This prohibits the hiring of illegal immigrants. It starts forcing firms to check for citizenship, but it also provides a path to citizenship, amnesty for illegal aliens, and helps to further strengthen the status of legal immigrants. So this is a good thing, and it was pro-immigration from a conservative, from the Reagan administration. The 1990s, Americans with Disabilities Act is passed in 1990 under Bush 1. This prohibits discrimination against those with disabilities, but it also requires quote-unquote reasonable accommodations. This very vague term, reasonable accommodations, has probably led to more lawsuits than anything else in the history of the United States. It's pretty interesting. Like, if you want to learn about the effect of vagueness on the legal system, just go look up some research about reasonable accommodations. It's fun and interesting stuff, and there have been thousands or tens of thousands of legal cases because of this really crappy terminology, okay? Then you have the Family and Medical Leave Act of 1993. This is under Clinton, Bill Clinton, and this allows 12 weeks of unpaid leave for emergency family situations. Someone in your home has cancer. Maybe you want to go take some time off because you just had a child or whatever it is. But you get up to 12 weeks per year. This has become incredibly important under COVID, like I talked about earlier. So anyone who's interested in sort of writing a paper about this, let me know, and I'd love to send you some information. It's pretty interesting, and I'm not even really sure which side of it I fall on, because this is abused sometimes too, where someone will just take 12 weeks off every year, and then 3 months later you come back to work and you've lost all your skills, or you've sort of fallen behind. It can be a problem, but I would say most people don't take advantage of this. Okay, so don't get me wrong. It's a pretty small likelihood, and I think it's a small likelihood that people take advantage of basically any government program, right? For those who argue like you should just end a program because someone's taking advantage of it, like, that's natural human behavior. The government and politicians have a responsibility to check these things, right, and to have some enforcement mechanism, but most people aren't just trying to completely screw the system all the time. I don't really think it works like that. Who knows? I might be wrong, but the research I've read suggests that that's not really true. Just like, voting fraud. No one does that. No, why would you risk years in prison over one vote? There is no evidence for it anywhere. So I don't know. I think this is sort of the same thing as the voter fraud problem. Okay, we are going to move on to monopsony. Weird word. The sort of the opposite of monopoly. This is the idea that there's only one buyer, right? Give me a second. So you only have a single purchaser of a product. So in that sense, just like a monopoly can help set the price, can manipulate the price and manipulate the output, so can a monopsony manipulate the price of labor. Okay? So the idea here is that you have one firm, you have lots of laborers who want to be employed at that one firm, and all of their skills are basically equivalent, but this is the only firm out there that can hire for those skills. And so for a real world example, think of like a local, I don't know, maybe like a meat packing plant or something like that, or like the only chemical plant in this country or state or whatever it is. I'm trying to think of a hypothetical, but you're the only meat packing plant within 200 miles, and that's basically the only hiring facility, the only job hiring in the area, and so the meatpacking plant can sort of undercut the actual wage that would exist in a competitive market. Okay. All right, so if you look at figure 14.8, you see the marginal cost of labor. I just want you to note here that under normal competitive market conditions, your supply of labor would be S of L, the market S of L. However, for a monopsony, you can pay less than the market. You have an incentive to pay your employees less than the going rate, basically. And so you're always going to be on this marginal cost, this MC. Now, there's a lot going on here. Here's the idea. You are a monopsony. You need labor. And you're the only one in the area who can offer a job, so you can kind of set your own price. The first employee costs you almost nothing, right? The second employee costs you more, but it also forces you to pay the first employee more. And then the third employee costs you more, but it forces you to pay the second and the first employee more. Why? Because you are setting up your own internal competition inside of your firm, right? If you only have one employee, there is absolutely nothing that they can do about it to affect the price of their labor. That makes sense, right? However, when you have a second employee, well, suddenly now the first employee is mad because this guy's making more than him, so now you got to bump up this guy, and on and on and on until you hit the marginal cost, right? Where it'll start costing you more to hire employees, so you just don't do it. And so this means that if you move down to 14.9, what happens is the firm does not go to the equilibrium point where demand for labor meets the supply for labor in a purely competitive market. So this would be where DL crosses SL. That would be the competitive market's equilibrium point. And we would just draw a line horizontal, and that would determine wages, and it would determine the supply of labor in the market if you drew a dotted line from that equilibrium point left and down. All right. Unfortunately, because of the monopsonistic system, Now we are forced, the firm actually decides that it will choose its labor demand based on marginal cost instead of the actual supply in the market. And so where marginal cost of each new employee meets the demand line, you get your actual monopsonistic equilibrium point. And so where they actually drew the dotted line down, that is where you will have your labor supply, which clearly is less than where it would be if the market decided. But it also means that now you draw your labor line down to where the supply line is, S of L, and that is where your wage is set. So not only are you undersupplying the market with labor, you are also paying them less than the market would determine. And so this is a real big problem with monopsonies, is that it's bad for the individual because you're not being paid as much as you should be, but it's also bad for the society because now you have this underutilization of the firm and of the potential labor in the market and lower wages, and so this really hurts everyone, and eventually it will drag your entire economy down because your GDP is not at its production possibilities frontier. All right. Okay, so now we will move on to 14.3, market power on the supply side of labor markets, and we'll talk about unions. Unions are a dying breed, and that's a sad thing because unions can do some wonderful things, as we'll talk about. First, I would like you to look at figure 14. The highlighted sentence here. One point I would like to make is that union members earn about 20 to 25% more than non-union members when controlling for everything else. When you control for education, job skills, year on the job, blah, blah, blah. Throw in a control variable, scientists have controlled for it, union members always get paid more. All right, so that's the first thing. They help to balance out the monopsonists' power over the labor market and pull it closer to reality. Right? The more realistic equilibrium. If you look at figure 1, you can see that union members increased in the 1930s and 1940s, but then it started to see its inevitable decline after the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act. It stayed pretty stable until about the 1970s when we saw stagflation and the sort of the death of the manufacturing industry in America and many, many other things. But the point here is just that you can see that labor union membership has declined dramatically since the 1970s, and really since the 1950s or so. And then if we take a little snapshot of just since the 1980s until basically today, you could just see that it is halved. Union membership has halved in the last 35 to 40 years. So this is a real problem. Another thing I would point out is that if you look at the next one, which is from the OECD and from these researchers, Piketty and Saiz, who are excellent researchers, actually. I've read a couple of their books. You can see that union membership is on an exact opposite path from inequality. So one of the main drivers of inequality both in America and across the globe over the last 100 years or so has been the death of unions. And because unions are not there to fight for workers and to fight for laborers and to fight for fair wages and to force CEOs to give up some of their exorbitant packages, you're seeing the top 10%'s share of the income grow drastically. And so now in 2008, and this has gotten worse since, way worse since, but in 2008, when union membership had dropped down to about 12% overall in the United States, the share of the top 10%'s income is about 50% of all income in America. So the top 10% now is taking half of all income in the United States. And worse. It's worse. It's a lot worse since then. So this is some food for thought. That's a scary idea that the top 10% and even the top 1% are holding 50, 60, 70% of all the assets in the United States. And it gets even worse when you start talking about things like bonds and stocks and land ownership and assets and things like that. So this is a real problem. This is a real problem. And this is a very, very good look at the consequences of that problem, or the causes, at least one of the causes of why inequality is shooting through the roof. And it's because of the death of unions. Right. Okay. So why are unions declining? There are a few reasons. One is because of the shift of manufacturing to services. And this is more of a false reason than a true reason, but it is hypothesized, and it is a small percentage of the whole 100% of why we're seeing union decline. You are seeing the death of manufacturing in the United States due to globalization, due to poor strategy, due to the cost of labor, all of these sorts of things. But I would also point out that union memberships in manufacturing have remained almost exactly the same over time. So this is a pretty poor excuse for an explanation. Globalization and foreign competition. Again, this is sort of tied into the above, like for the reason that manufacturing is dying. But I would also say this is a little bit better explanation than the above because of the pressures of globalization. You can't really tell a firm, like, you have to pay us this much, because it doesn't really work like that anymore. It's more of a, yes, they do have an effect, and they can help to bump up their wages and reduce the amount of profits that the corporation is just taking from the system. But also wages are determined by economic trends, less than just like, this is what I want, right? So this isn't a great explanation either. The third, we have less need for unions because governments have put in place protections for workers. Yes, this is true, but if you look cross-comparatively, at least, most nations have put in protections, the same protections or even more protections, because America's sort of always behind the ball when it comes to protecting women, minorities, labor rights, environmental protections, etc. We're generally much further behind than the leaders like Denmark, Sweden, Switzerland, England, France, etc. Where was I? I'm sorry, I kind of got lost. So lots of different nations have seen protections being passed across the board, and yet a lot of nations still have high union membership. But this is a good start, right? Because I think across the nation, across the globe, we are seeing union memberships decline in most developed countries. And so it's not a great explanation, but it's probably better than the first two. And then I would say number 4 is probably the best explanation, because it explains why union membership is so low, specifically in America, versus in other countries. And it's just because the legal environment is detrimental to union membership. There is a vast natural difference in power between laborers and between firms, right? Firms have a lot of money. The individual laborer has almost no money, has really not an attorney. A lot of times they're not that educated. I mean, they're right, it ranges, but when we're talking about some of these manufacturing jobs, they're not all that educated. And so the business, on the other hand, has at least relatively near infinite resources. They often have lobbyists and million-dollar attorneys, and they have a lot of power. And so, over time, unions have been demonized by private firms, and politicians have also latched onto this idea. Part of the problem is that there's so much money in the American system, the American political system. If you took some of that money out, it would also balance out laborers' power politically versus firms. But firms have worked year after year after year after year to degrade the ability of individuals to unionize, because unions offer labor side power, and can force the corporation to reinvest in other ways than just CEO extreme benefits packages, right? And so there's a lot of pushback from firms, from lobbyists, from attorneys in the court systems, in all of these places. All of the money on the firm's producer side has been thrown at the idea that we want to just destroy labor unions in America. And they've convinced pretty much a vast swathe of the American population, but also the court systems and the politicians, that this is for the best to destroy unions, but the social research would say otherwise. The scientists are saying, no, unions can be a very good thing. Unions are one of the reasons why we had such economic booms in the 1950s and 60s. They are the reasons they protect against exploitation of workers. They protect against extreme compensation packages. They also help in that it reduces like the very upper people's wages and helps to bring these people up, so you get a much stronger middle class, and the middle class is the one who buys things, and these people don't really buy anything. The super rich, right? They have limitations on how much money that they can spend. I mean, you can only buy 100 pairs of jeans before you go, oh man, I have way too many jeans. So for many reasons, union membership is a good thing. It can be taken too far, don't get me wrong, but so can private business, right? Which we have seen many times. So I would say at least think about why unions are conceptually and theoretically a good thing. Yes, they can get out of hand, but anything can get out of hand. That's not a reason to just dismiss them wholeheartedly. There should be a reason to make sure that they don't get out of hand, but just giving private firms all of the power in the equation is not healthy for the economy or for the individual laborer. All right. Here we can see union membership. If you look at this Forbes statistic graph, you can see union membership across the OECD. There's some interesting stuff here. So the United States is about on board with France, South Korea, and Turkey. Three of those, okay, if you look at the bottom five, right, you have Mexico, France, United States, South Korea, Turkey. Three of those are fantastically good economies. Three of those are very productive economies, while two of them aren't, right? Mexico and Turkey. But then if you look at the very top, you have Italy, Belgium, Sweden, Iceland. Belgium, Sweden, Iceland are doing really well and did really well after 2008 and are generally doing really well even now during COVID times. Italy is a mess. So there are other things than just union membership here at play, right? It's a very interesting thing, but there are very divergent paths in these different groups. So don't think that unions explain everything, but unions can be a powerful explanation for the health of the middle class. All right, moving on to the next one, which I got from this Utopia, blah, 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 trade union membership. I just thought it was an interesting graph. It's from the OECD statistics, which are put out by the World Bank. And you can see that union membership in general is declining over time. But then, if you look at this final one, 14.8, it's a little different, right? Because in some nations, while union membership may be low or maybe high, even like Austria. Austria is 37% union membership, which is very, very high, at least compared to the United States or France. But then this other one, union coverage, I think, is the more important statistic. This is the percentage of the workers whose wages are determined by union bargaining. And in countries like France and Austria, Germany, Sweden, others, far more wages are determined through collective bargaining than actual union membership. Okay, so many times you even have union members on, by law, union members must be on the board of the corporations in these states. So in Germany, Austria, France, Sweden, not France, Germany, Austria, Sweden, Switzerland, and others, if you want to be a publicly listed company and you want to be a private corporation, a publicly listed stock corporation, or if you want to get grants from the state, then you must have union members on your board of directors. And they found that this is a really good way of helping sort of the bottom and middle classes and the labor class rather than just the super elites, right? So it was very interesting. The United States, while we are only at about 11 or 12% of union membership, we are also only at about 11 or 12% collective bargaining coverage. While it is very different in, say, France and Austria, where you have 9% and 37% respectively union membership, but now you have 95% and 99% of all people's wages being affected by union membership collective bargaining. So very, very, very different things. All right. Bilateral monopoly. So we're also going to talk about this. This is the idea of now we're sticking together, the monopsony, the firm who can control labor and wages, and the union. And so this doesn't create perfect competition. It doesn't create a competitive market. What it does create is bilateral monopoly. So the monopsonist's position remains. They will still decide to supply or to purchase labor at the point where the marginal cost crosses the demand curve for labor, right? So we're still going to get L star. We're still going to undersupply labor in the market. We're not purchasing as much as we should because we're a monopsonist firm. And wages will be less than in an equilibrium. And if the firm itself could decide wages, it would be at WM. But now you have the labor union actually involved, and so while the labor is shorted inevitably in this system, in both the monopsonist system and the bilateral monopoly where the union is involved, labor will always be underpurchased by the firm. However, wages can be affected. So even though labor is lower than it should be, now the monopsonist firm cannot just decide that wages is going to be at WM, the monopsonist's ideal position, right? The lowest wages they could possibly pay. Now at least the union is trying to drag up the wages so that wages, depending on the relative strength of the firm versus the labor union, it will fall somewhere between I think that's what is that? Anyway, between the two W's, right, where the top W is where the labor union would try to set wages, and the bottom WM is where the firm would try to set wages. It's going to fall somewhere between there, depending on the strength of the collective bargaining power of each team, if you will. All right? Okay, I think we're going to call it there for the day. Thank you all for sticking with me. I know these lectures are starting to get longer and a lot more complicated. That's how classes work. You build and you build, and hopefully we can sort of tie in all of these different concepts together until you start to make these synaptic connections in your mind, which are necessary for long-term learning. So I hope you all enjoyed the lecture. I hope you stay happy and healthy. I will get the exam out probably tomorrow, and again, you'll have probably 10 days on it. So take your time. Please get me a nice product that you would be proud of, and good luck to you all. Stay healthy. Bye.